I love the whirling of the dervishes. I love the beauty of rare innocence. You don't need no crystal ball. Don't fall for a magic wand. We humans got it all. We perform the miracles. Them heavy people hit me in a soft spot. Them heavy people help me. Kate Bush.
Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Martin Perkins.
And I'm Ben Umstead.
Them heavy people, whether they be our inner voices or the coarse expression of a harsh outer world, the opportunity to heal and grow comes with our intuitive response to them heavy people. If we see them solely through the literal and reactive expressions in life, their unfelt intellectual boxing of life, so much gets lost. By feeling the messy and beautiful dancing of the colorful and vibrant leaves that inhabit our soul's landscape, we can allow ourselves to truly be, to grieve the need to create neat piles of intellectualized order, to be creative in how we process the necessary messiness that comes with our being human. On such paths, we grow our capacity to look upon suffering in ourselves and in others directly in the eye, rather than turning away from it with neglect or intellect.
So, when you speak of intuition, right, you're referencing its root to know oneself. And we talk about this all the time on the podcast, whether we call it healing and growth, Tao Yin, language of the soul, inner wisdom. To know oneself is to have a practice that supports this inner language, that expresses itself uniquely within each of us.
So there's a hard fact. Knowing oneself is really hard work, and quite strangely, very uncommon amongst us human beings. It's hard work because we have to look at things that we may not like or admire about ourselves. It's hard work to still recognize and still love ourselves just as we are, to be loving and kind with who we come to know more intimately within ourselves. This is painful work, and by my description, both strange and on some level understandable as to why it is uncommon for human beings to have a practice and genuinely knowing oneself, knowing ourselves, versus the many masks that can be worn and or are worn in the world. Masks that become armor within us over time. An embodiment of what Kate Bush means by them heavy people in the world around us.
So, this leads me to ground myself in the question here. There's that intuition itself in the grounding, of course, but it's an important question to ask for the sake of our conversation and everyone listening. What is the true nature of our intuition?
Speaking from my own personal exploration, my own experience, in many ways, in its linguistic roots, meaning that its Latin root intuere means to know oneself, but also very broadly in any practice of life that allows us to be well rested, practiced in stillness, and at its core, engaged in presence. This set of practices allows us to meet life experience with wisdom, and therefore, regardless of how your intuitive gift may show up in life, to apply it in ways that further the possibility of healing and growth in ourselves, in our relationships. There's a unfortunate framing of intuition within the realm of what we can call the paranormal, which is that which exists beyond scientific understanding. Yes, it is a possible aspect of the intuitive experience, the paranormal, that is. But in truth, it's not its central tenet, regardless of how it's framed in the popular culture. To heal and grow in the exploration of our own wisdom, and then allowing that to find expression through our unique genius, through that journey, is what intuition, to know oneself more deeply, is all about.
Listening to you speak about intuition and the hard work of knowing oneself more deeply, I'm reminded of a phenomenon in the world right now that I believe is important for us to address. And that's the rise in this populist, anti intellectual thought and response, right? I very clearly see this as not being related to intuition, but for the sake of what we're talking about, I'd like to unpack that. So, why is this populist, anti intellectual response not intuition?
Because its end goal has no regard for self knowledge. For me, this has been the most painful part of bearing witness to our national dialogue, the willingness to allow self ignorance to be promoted as an illusory truth effect. That is, the tendency to believe false information to be correct after repeated exposure. It feels like the world is full of poorly trained magicians, all willing to lie to themselves and to others so they can reach their throne of aspiration on the shortest and most profitable path possible, and with little to no regard for its effect on others.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And the power that comes with this type of neglect of the self, I find to be really alarming. So, with such blind hubris, eh, how does anti intellectualism become so appealing?
It's a great question, and I'll take a shot at it. Um, it's sometimes hard to frame what on some level makes no sense whatsoever, but let's take a shot at it, right? Um, so anti-intellectualism frames logic, science, education as opposing common thought and populism. What is seen as common sense, but in the current climate simply is a negation of any opposing thought. It's often a framing around dismantling existing power structures for the sake of, in this era, a centralized power or authoritarianism, a centralization of both wealth and power. It, along with how Americans are using technologies such as AI, has the net effect of human beings who are both intellectually and emotionally less intelligent. We, as human beings, are far less likely to ask difficult questions of ourselves and far more likely to see the world through the lens of division.
Hmm. Okay, I think, a major happening within that division are groups of people who inflame this fantasy of conflict and war, right? Flying the dual flag of anti-intellectualism and anti-intuition, ultimately leading them to this misguided reverence for destruction.
Right. It's a fantasy of seeing conflict, any conflict, and ultimately war in its many forms, as a way to solve what is deemed as wrong within the world, whether it be with our partner, within our family, or with our children, or our neighbor, or at this point, fishermen in boats off the coast of Venezuela, right? This romanticization or this fantasizing of conflict or war, it's existed a long time. I, as a young boy in the 1960s and early 70s, my friends and I, we played cowboys and Indians and army. We shot each other, we play fought, we acted out the scenes we saw from TV shows like Combat or The Green Hornet or Batman.
Taking that thread, it's interesting to note that during my childhood in the 1990s, there were pretty much no more cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers, Axis and allies, right? My combat fantasies were almost exclusively metaphorical with superheroes and supervillains. This leads me to state very simply that all of this is the indoctrination of children, and especially white boys, right, into the notion that might makes right.
And today we have a president acting out these childish actions, posting AI images of bombing American cities with feces, inflaming the fantasy of a civil war for groups who have no felt experience of what actual warfare is like. A false belief that somehow white men are being persecuted. American exceptionalism at its truest and most twisted roots. Division that benefits the oligarchical class through greater and more extreme wealth disparity. And it's veiled. It's entirely hidden within and for the sake of an investment class that uses all of this as a form of self-preservation and as a path to a better life. And all the while, this game of musical chairs or, chutes and ladders is being played, and it keeps removing more and more chairs or ladders as access points to this upward pathway that's but for the chosen few.
Yeah, I think baked into this sowing of chaos, right, and division amongst the middle class, the working people at large, is this idea that there are a few ladders left for those that serve the interests of the oligarchs and the investment class, that by leading the charge, so to speak, these people, they'll be let into the club or at least somewhere in the building.
Yeah, the back door, right?
The back door. The service entrance.
Right, the service entrance.
What's really interesting to note here is in response to these delusions of civil war amongst working people in the United States, many veterans are coming forward in online spaces and in their communities. And they're sharing their felt experience in warfare, right? They're breaking down the fantasy that is being pursued here. I think that speaks volumes of their authenticity, their wisdom, their self-awareness, and their sense of duty. And I think that is inherently linked to what we're speaking to here with intuition, the root of what it means to be intuitive. They show how intuition is a grounding practice, not just for ourselves, but also for those around us, and especially in the national discourse.
I've spent the better part of 20 years building things like tree houses, transforming barns into workshops, building additions onto my home, and in the middle of it all, creating a creative and healing center with its treatment room, classroom, and an office/herb room. Along the way, in smaller creative projects, I've used wood, glass, ceramic tiles, and other multimedia materials to build mosaics and furniture and other pieces. This evolution in creativity and learning through practice and growth has led me to the point where I am now building projects for others. On this journey in bringing creative projects outside Simplicity Farm, I'm currently bringing two new projects to fruition: a Kokopelli themed outdoor shower at a friend's residence, and a salt cave for a holistic practice in the greater Bowie area. These projects excite me in ways that express a sense of creative calling to my life. I'm deeply grateful to be adding these expressions into my life and into the world. If you have a project you'd like help in bringing into being, reach out to me. I'm taking on new projects for creation. Please take a moment and go to martinperkins.com/artisan. There may be something I've created that will really connect with you. Aside from the commission work I'm currently doing, there will be glass mosaic windows and other pieces offered on e-commerce sites and possibly at art shows around the DMV. Subscribe to the newsletter to keep up with what's happening with the artwork, as well as the podcast and my acupuncture/herbal clinic.
As burgeoning podcasters, the greatest gift you can offer Martin and I is to share this podcast. Word of mouth remains the most genuine way to share the art and media that you love and care about. So in advance, we thank you. And now, back to the conversation.
As a counter to the populist anti-intellectualization prominent in our national discourse, we also have those who use intellectualization as a defense mechanism. People using harsh reasoning so they can avoid uncomfortable or distressing emotions. And counter to how it's often framed in our discourse, intellectualization often negates wisdom. It does so because of wisdom's rooting in simplicity and kindness, right? The recognition that emotional intelligence is in many ways, it dwells within the realm of the intuitive, right? Into the felt experience of who we are. And, intellectualization gives little consideration to the need for self-knowledge, right? It's always the thought I can think my way out of this. I can outsmart whatever is happening to me, right? Instead of feeling into it and acknowledging its inner roots, right? That notion of self-responsibility, right? And to have it as well grounded in this foundation that needs to be connected to our own sense of simplicity and kindness. And so the question then is, well, how do we bring this simplicity or kindness into the conversation? And I offer that complex questions need self-care at their foundation. So a foundation in self-knowledge and self-care that is born of being well-rested, that has some kind of stillness practice within it so that I can learn to be with myself, and a willingness to practice being present with what is so right in my life, right phenomenologically in the life that I'm living. And that no matter what, no matter how painful it may be, to bear witness to what's so. Bearing witness is a necessary first step toward a form of self-sacrifice that isn't tribal in nature. It's interesting, right, that we use that word tribal in association with acting out of self-interest. Historically, much of what we call democracy has its roots with the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederation and their form of representative democracy. There was a representative from each of the nations, each of the six nations, plus an individual chosen from the six, who didn't lead as much as assist in finding common ground for the group. This individual would seek to find universal consensus around an issue, and if it couldn't be found, the representative group would not make a decision. The sense being that unless there could be a universal consensus, a decision wasn't worth being made without it. In our contemporary world, decisions are often framed around and through the lens of division, the divided lens of winning and losing, right? And it's this social media game of trying to convince the public who won and who lost, right? It's not even about convincing us of the merits of their process. It's just trying to convince us of who won. And in the process, this form of self sacrifice for the sake of the whole gets lost. And, you know, that notion of what it really means to be tribal in the sense of caring for the other gets entirely lost. And in my personal life and in my inner practice, without any claims to, per se doing it with any high degree of excellence, but with a sense of sacrifice and duty, I do practice forgiveness, gratitude, and trust. They are the foundation of what I see as they're in many ways, they're the three legs of the stool to a sense of faith that I have in myself and in the world around me. And then ultimately, they are the foundation of the kind of love that I aspire and practice offering into the world. And, without these practices, we lack the discernment needed to express a love that is less conditional or restricted in nature, right?
Yeah, I'm deeply moved by that because it does speak to this discernment and all of these aspects that we're talking about where it falls into intellectualization as a defense mechanism, anti-intuition, anti-intellectualization. There's another aspect here. There's another response that is occurring. It's arising predominantly amongst younger folk. And it speaks to that lack of discernment. It speaks to collapse, both emotionally and intellectually. I think a lot of this is brought on by an over reliance on augmented reality, yes, but especially cyberspace, and ultimately an undercultivated knowledge of the self. That lack of discernment, that lack of self awareness, or that sense of not even wanting to step into those places. And we encounter it all over. One encounter I had recently happened in New York City. There was this rampant, it was also heavily vandalized, subway ad campaign for friend.com. Now, friend.com is an AI pendant, and I would characterize it as this technology that preys on lonely, busy urbanites, young professionals. What this pendant speaks to here is how freeze shows up in the modern expression of the fight or flight response, right? The pendant is offering the ability to freeze as a response to stress. But in this sense, the freeze means that both the mind and the heart end up being replaced by this deceitful, predatory AI yes man. Users of the pendant are avoiding things that can feel scary and painful, especially when they involve life changing in ways that impact our sense of self, right? The deception offered by the pendant functions to protect what is seen as a safe identity and any accompanying self esteem with that safe, small identity, I would offer often. This is the case. And this is without aiding in any way the ability to adapt nor integrate into what is a rapidly changing world. So, this lack of adaptability, I mean, that's understandable given how it removes the intellect and the heart from its crucial processing function. And I want to note here the integration of the intellect and the heart. Because when we talk about intellectualization as a defense mechanism, there's also the intellect and the beauty of that that can come from integration with that heartfelt sense and that wisdom. So the AI pendant that friend.com is presenting is one aspect to this, right? It's being marketed to young professionals who want to have a constant companion without any of the messiness or growth that comes with friendship with a fellow human being. This lends me to pause and scope out a little bit. I mean, we all notice the increase in the number of us humans that are seeking to be intimate with AI, with an AI companion. I think that that's really important to note. An AI companion, not just AI as an information tool, but AI as a substitute for a person. And we are starting to notice right now what is happening in regards to our health, and particularly with children and adolescents. So there's a very clear epidemic of loneliness that's occurring within children, higher anxiety rates. And one aspect within this that's interesting to note, futurism.com has a piece around high schoolers, 1 in 5 high schoolers having an emotional and romantic relationship with an AI companion. And this has led to so many aspects of being a young person already so vulnerable in the world to a greater vulnerability, a greater loss of self. And I think at this juncture, a lot of our listeners might know about this case, but it's important to note a mother that's suing OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, because her son committed suicide at the behest of the AI. But at the same time, this is really distressing to note. At the same time that this is happening, that this mom is suing OpenAI, announced that they'll be pivoting to erotica. And they're pinpointing something here. They're finally embracing what these data sets have been showing us for several years. People want to experience sexual sensations through the assistance of AI. Initially, I presented that through people just want to have sex with AI, right? But we have to remember that this is an illusion. This is not real in this sense. So, what does this settle into when we focus on intuition, healing, and growth? We often talk about on the podcast this notion of getting out of our own way when it comes to self doubt, right? But what the friend.com pendant and all of these studies and reports that I've noted here are showing, I believe, is the erosion, perhaps even the elimination of the self simply because we're afraid or perhaps don't even have the tools to know how to take care of ourselves. So, as such, we're giving away our self awareness. I mean, exploring all of these topics today, I'm left feeling scared myself, jolted in that way. To read through these things and share these larger experiences of humanity right now and to focus on what we focus on here is often very grounding, but sometimes it does leave me in a topsy-turvy place. And I can say that right now, that's how I'm feeling. And it does lead me to ponder, how do we know if we're intellectualizing or overthinking rather than just being quite simply self-aware?
Big question. And frankly, it's one that involves practice. But one way to know if you're intellectualizing is if you feel on some level disconnected from what you're talking about, from what you're exploring. If it feels as if you're discussing or you're engaged in a process with yourself in which each of the parts feels disparate on some level, separated, then in all likelihood you're intellectualizing it, right? On some level, you're disconnected from yourself or the world around you. So, the image that we are using for this episode in our newsletter and as well on social media, it's a multimedia art piece that was created by my daughter, Luna Perkins. It's titled Community Hands, and it was recently shown at an art show at the Bowie City Hall around the theme of building community. Luna took pictures of people holding hands and brought these images together with one word responses to the question, what does community mean to you? at the opening for the show, there's a lot of social interaction, and I'm sitting at one point and begin to engage in conversation with a couple nearby. And I casually ask them, are either of you artists? Or, do you have an art piece in the show? Or does someone have an art piece displayed? And in unison, they answered no. They simply enjoy coming to the art openings at City Hall to see the artwork and to meet people. And they shared they've been doing this, attending these art openings for many years. I'm smiling inside, realizing in so many ways how these folks personify what is so needed in our world. We went on to talk about many subjects, and as I came away from the experience with a deep appreciation for these human beings at an art show where we were connecting person to person in the world just for the sake of connection. In the process of taking the pictures that Luna used for her piece, and Luna she can be at times a little shy. And she shared with me her willingness to step out of her comfort zone and to ask a couple at a museum who were holding hands if it was okay to take their picture. And, of course, they consented, and they're actually in the piece. And, these examples of the couple coming for the art show just for person-to-person connection, Luna reaching out for the sake of her creative endeavor and connecting with this couple at a museum. These are examples that speak to how community can happen, right? It's not always convenient. It's not always comfortable. It's not in our comfort zone. And yet we need to set the intention to connect with people in ways that aren't really complicated at all. It's just about bringing simplicity and kindness into our lives and letting the world in rather than keeping it at bay, because it's at times can feel scary, divided. My experience as a whole is that when I allow myself, heart and mind, to engage with the world with kindness and in the simplest of ways, the world responds in kind.
Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.